The fluorescent lights of Maple Street Diner flickered to life at exactly 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before official opening time, because that's how long it took Sarah Mitchell to get the coffee brewing, the grill warming, and the register counted before the first customer inevitably pushed through the door at 6 o'clock sharp. She'd been working the morning shift for 3 years now, ever since she'd dropped out of community college to help her mom with medical bills, and in that time she'd learned that small-town diners operated on a rhythm as reliable as a heartbeat. The same faces, the same orders, the same conversations, recycled with minor variations day after day after day. Sarah tied her apron around her waist, tucked a pen behind her ear, and pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, just as old Mr. Henderson's pickup truck pulled into the parking lot right on schedule. He'd order 2 eggs over easy, bacon crispy wheat toast and black coffee, and he'd leave exactly $2 on the table before heading to his hardware store down the street. By 6:15, the counter would be lined with regulars, retired factory workers, early shift nurses from the hospital, truck drivers passing through, all of them creatures of habit, all of them predictable, all of them safe in their routines. Sarah had grown comfortable in this predictability, had found a strange peace in the monotony of it all, because at least here she knew what to expect. At least here nothing ever really changed or surprised her in ways that mattered. The bell above the door chimed as Mr. Henderson entered, raising one weathered hand in greeting, and Sarah called out "Morning, Mr. H" while reaching for the coffee pot that was always ready for him. She poured his cup, took his order even though she already knew it, and moved through the familiar choreography of her shift with the muscle memory of someone who'd performed these exact movements thousands of times before. By 7 o'clock, the diner hummed with the low buzz of conversation and clinking silverware, the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee thick in the air, everything exactly as it should be, everything perfectly normal. That's when the black Mercedes pulled up outside, incongruous against the backdrop of pickup trucks and aging sedans, and Sarah felt the first whisper of unease creep up her spine. She watched through the window as the driver's side door opened, and a man in his 50s stepped out, expensive suit, polished shoes, the kind of groomed appearance that screamed money and city life, and then he walked around to open the passenger door. The woman who emerged moved slowly, carefully, her silver hair perfectly styled, her cream-colored cardigan and slacks expensive but understated, and something about the way she held herself, the way her eyes darted around the parking lot before settling on the diner's entrance, made Sarah's stomach tighten with an instinct she couldn't quite name. The man's hand rested on the small of the woman's back, guiding her toward the door, and from a distance it might have looked solicitous, caring even, but Sarah had learned to read people in her years behind the counter, had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was off, when the surface of a situation didn't match what was happening underneath. They entered the diner, the bell chiming cheerfully, and Sarah watched as the man steered the elderly woman toward a booth in the back corner, away from the windows, away from the other customers, his grip on her elbow just a fraction too tight to be gentle. The woman sat down heavily, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them flat on the table, and when her eyes met Sarah's across the diner, there was something in that gaze, fear, desperation, a silent scream trapped behind a carefully composed expression that made every instinct in Sarah's body stand up and pay attention. Sarah grabbed 2 menus and a pair of water glasses, her mind racing as she approached the corner booth, every nerve ending suddenly alert in a way they hadn't been in months, maybe years. Up close, the details crystallized into something even more unsettling. The woman's makeup was flawless, professional even, but it couldn't quite hide the hollow exhaustion beneath her eyes, and her hands, those trembling hands pressed flat against the laminate table, bore no rings despite the pale indentation on her left ring finger, where one had clearly sat for decades. The man looked up as Sarah approached, his smile practiced and empty, the kind of expression people wore when they were performing normalcy, rather than actually feeling it. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to pump through her veins. "Can I start you folks off with some coffee?" The man answered immediately, not even glancing at his companion. "2 coffees, cream and sugar for both, and we'll need a few minutes with the menu." The elderly woman said nothing, her lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, and Sarah noticed the way her fingers curled slightly against the table, almost like she was trying to grip something that wasn't there. Sarah set down the menus and poured the coffee, using the task as an excuse to linger, to observe, her training as a waitress merging with something deeper, more primal, the instinct that told her when someone at the bar had drunk too much, when a couple's argument was about to turn physical, when a customer was planning to skip out on their check. She'd learned to trust these instincts, had learned that the small inconsistencies in human behavior often told bigger stories than words ever could. The man's phone buzzed and he pulled it out, immediately absorbed in the screen, and in that moment the elderly woman's eyes snapped up to meet Sarah's, and what passed between them was electric and unmistakable, a desperate silent plea that transcended language, that communicated volumes in the space of a single heartbeat. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the expression, had seen it before on the faces of women in bad relationships, in the eyes of kids with parents who hurt them, in the desperate glances of people trapped in situations they couldn't escape. The woman's right hand moved almost imperceptibly, her index finger tapping twice against the table, then her hand moved to her throat in a gesture that could have been casual, could have been nothing, but the deliberateness of it, the way her eyes bored into Sarah, made it clear this was communication, this was a message. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the weight of recognition settling over her shoulders like a physical thing, because she understood now with absolute certainty that something was very, very wrong here. The man looked up from his phone and instantly the woman's expression shifted, smoothed into careful blankness, her hand dropping back to the table, and Sarah understood that too, the practiced deception, the survival mechanism of someone who'd learned to hide their truth from a watch. "We'll have the breakfast special," the man said, not asking the woman what she wanted, not even looking at her. 2 orders: scrambled eggs, bacon, wheat toast. Sarah wrote it down, her mind already working through possibilities, through options, through the question of what exactly she was witnessing, and what she could possibly do about it. She'd heard stories, of course, had seen the news reports about elder abuse, about financial exploitation, about family members who isolated and controlled aging parents, but she'd never thought she'd encounter it herself, never imagined she'd be standing in her own diner face to face with what might be a crime in progress. As she turned to walk away, the woman's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, the touch lasting only a second before the man's attention snapped back and the woman released her grip. But in that brief contact, Sarah felt the papery softness of aged skin and the desperate pressure of someone trying to communicate through touch what they couldn't say with words, and she knew without any doubt that she couldn't walk away from this, couldn't pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen, couldn't let whatever was happening here continue without doing something, anything to help. Sarah pushed through the kitchen doors, her hands shaking slightly as she set the order ticket on the wheel for Marcus, the line cook who'd been working at Maple Street Diner since before she was born. "Marcus, table 7, 2 breakfast specials," she said, her voice tight, and he looked up from the grill with the kind of instant recognition that came from working alongside someone for years. "What's wrong?" he asked, spatula frozen mid-flip, and Sarah realized her face must have betrayed more than she'd intended. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but something's not right with the couple in the back booth." She turned to find Linda, the other morning waitress, a woman in her 60s who'd raised 4 kids and seen enough of life to have developed what she called her bullshit detector, and Sarah trusted that detector more than she trusted most people's sworn testimony. Linda was refilling ketchup bottles by the prep station, and she looked up as Sarah approached, her experienced eyes already reading the tension in Sarah's posture. "I need you to do me a favor," Sarah said quietly. "Table 7, back corner booth, older woman with a younger man, expensive clothes, black Mercedes outside. Can you take a look, tell me what you see?" Linda's expression shifted from curious to alert, and she nodded once, wiping her hands on her apron, before heading toward the dining room. Sarah watched through the small window in the kitchen door as Linda made a pass by the booth, ostensibly checking on nearby tables, and when she returned to the kitchen 2 minutes later, her face was grim. "The woman's terrified," Linda said without preamble, keeping her voice low. "She's not eating, not drinking, barely moving, and that man, he's watching her like a hawk, monitoring every breath she takes." Sarah's suspicions crystallized into certainty, and she pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as she wrestled with the question of what to do next. Calling 911 felt both excessive and absolutely necessary, because what exactly would she report? A feeling, an instinct, the frightened eyes of a stranger? But then she remembered a training session the diner owner had made them all attend last year, a presentation by a social worker about recognizing signs of abuse and trafficking, and one of the key points had been about trusting your gut, about how victims often couldn't ask for help directly, about how sometimes silent signals were the only communication possible. The social worker had given them a card, a direct line to Adult Protective Services, and Sarah had tucked it into her wallet thinking she'd never need it, but now she dug it out with trembling fingers and stared at the number. "I'm calling," she said to Linda, who nodded approval, and Sarah stepped into the back office, closing the door behind her before dialing with hands that wouldn't quite steady. The phone rang 3 times before a calm female voice answered. "Adult Protective Services, this is Jennifer speaking." Sarah took a breath and began explaining what she'd observed, forcing herself to be clear and specific. The woman's fear, the man's controlling behavior, the silent plea for help, lack of rings, the trembling hands, the way the woman had grabbed her wrist in that brief, desperate moment. Jennifer listened without interrupting, then asked a series of questions about the woman's appearance, approximate age, whether she appeared injured or drugged, whether Sarah had reason to believe she was in immediate danger. "Yes," Sarah said firmly, "I believe she's in immediate danger. I don't know what exactly is happening, but something is very wrong and she can't ask for help herself." Jennifer's voice remained calm, but Sarah could hear the shift to urgency beneath it. "I'm going to connect you with 911, she said. "They'll dispatch officers to your location, and I need you to try to keep the couple there until police arrive. Can you do that?" Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she agreed, as she was transferred to emergency dispatch, as she repeated her story to a new voice who promised units were being dispatched immediately, who told her to stay calm and not to confront the man, or let on that she'd called for help. Sarah emerged from the back office with her instructions clear but her nerves jangling like alarm bells. Keep them there, act natural, don't let on that help is coming. The police estimated 8 to 10 minutes response time, which meant Sarah needed to delay their departure if they tried to leave, needed to maintain the illusion that this was just another ordinary breakfast at just another ordinary diner on just another ordinary Thursday morning. She picked up the coffee pot and made a circuit of the dining room, topping off cups and exchanging pleasantries on autopilot while her mind raced through scenarios, through possibilities, through the terrible question of what would happen if the man decided to leave before the police arrived, if he sensed something was wrong, if Sarah's expression or behavior betrayed the truth. She approached table 7 with forced casualness, the coffee pot held out like an offering, and the man glanced up from his phone with that same empty smile. "More coffee?" Sarah asked, and he pushed his cup forward without a word. The elderly woman's cup sat untouched, the coffee gone cold, and when Sarah's eyes met hers again, she saw resignation there, a kind of exhausted acceptance that made Sarah's chest ache. She wanted to say something, wanted to communicate that help was coming, that she'd understood the silent message, that the woman just needed to hold on a little longer, but the man's attention was too focused, his presence too controlling. "Your food should be up in just a couple minutes," Sarah said, maintaining the performance of normalcy even though every muscle in her body was tense with alertness. Back at the counter, Linda caught her eye, and raised an eyebrow in question, and Sarah gave a tiny nod. "Police are coming, you'll just need to wait," and Linda understood immediately, shifting into a mode of subtle assistance, moving through the dining room with deliberate slowness, creating a kind of ambient presence that made leaving seem more complicated, more noticeable. Marcus rang the bell and Sarah grabbed the 2 breakfast plates, arranging them on her arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd carried hundreds of thousands of plates in her career, and she delivered them to table 7 with a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "2 breakfast specials," she announced, setting the plates down carefully. "Can I get you anything else?" The man picked up his fork immediately, but the elderly woman just stared at her plate, her hands remaining flat on the table, and Sarah noticed a small tremor running through her shoulders, noticed the way her breathing had gone shallow and quick. Time seemed to stretch and distort as Sarah moved through the next few minutes, simultaneously too fast and too slow, each second ticking past with agonizing deliberation while her eyes kept flicking to the window, watching for the flash of red and blue lights, listening for the wail of sirens. The other customers continued their meals, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the back corner, old Mr. Henderson reading his newspaper, a couple of nurses discussing their shift, a truck driver scrolling through his phone, all of them wrapped in the comfortable bubble of their own concerns, while just 20 feet away a woman sat in silent terror. At 7:34 a.m., exactly 9 minutes after Sarah had made the call, a patrol car pulled into the parking lot with no lights, no sirens, just the smooth professional arrival of officers responding to a welfare check. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief, felt the tension that had been coiling tighter and tighter in her spine suddenly release, and she had to grip the counter edge to steady herself. Two officers emerged from the vehicle, a tall man in his 40s with steel-gray hair and a younger woman with sharp, observant eyes, and they approached the diner entrance with the kind of casual confidence that came from years of handling situations that looked normal on the surface, but were situations where reading people and understanding unspoken dynamics meant the difference between helping and escalating. The bell chimed as they entered, and every head in the diner turned toward them with the automatic curiosity that police presence always generates. And Sarah saw the man at table 7 stiffen, saw his hand move to grip the elderly woman's wrist under the table, saw the flash of calculation cross his face as he understood that something had shifted, that the situation had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The two officers moved through the diner with practiced ease, their eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, and Sarah watched as the female officer's gaze locked onto table 7 with immediate recognition, some combination of Sarah's description and professional instinct guiding her directly to the source of the call. "Good morning," the male officer said, his voice carrying authority without aggression as he approached the booth. "I'm Officer Martinez and this is Officer Chen. We're responding to a welfare check." The man at the table stood quickly, his expensive suit rustling, his face arranging itself into an expression of confused concern. "A welfare check? I don't understand. Is there some kind of problem?" His voice was smooth, reasonable, the tone of someone accustomed to talking his way out of situations, and Sarah felt her stomach clench as she wondered if the officers would see through it, if they'd understand what was really happening, or if they'd accept his performance and leave the woman to whatever fate awaited her outside these walls. Officer Chen didn't respond to the man's question, instead turning her attention to the elderly woman still seated in the booth. "Ma'am," she said gently, "my name is Officer Chen. I'd like to speak with you for a moment if that's all right." The woman's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat Sarah thought she might not respond, might maintain the silence that had protected her thus far, but then something seemed to break inside her, some dam that had been holding back years or maybe decades of fear and control, and tears began streaming down her lined face. "Please," she whispered, the single word barely audible across the sudden hush that had fallen over the diner. "Please, help me." The man's facade cracked instantly, his face flushing with anger. "Mother, what are you doing? These officers have better things to do than respond to your confusion. She has dementia," he said, turning to the officers with an expression of pained patience. "She gets confused easily. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Officer Chen had already moved closer, positioning herself between the man and the woman with subtle but deliberate body language that made it clear she was creating a barrier. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the booth," she said firmly, and Officer Martinez shifted his stance, his hand resting casually near his belt in a way that suggested readiness for escalation if it came to that. The man's jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the officers, the woman, and the diner exit, and Sarah could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to determine if he could still control the narrative. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm her son. I take care of her. I brought her here for breakfast. Is that a crime?" Officer Martinez pulled out a notepad, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Nobody said anything about a crime, sir. We're just here to make sure everyone's safe and where they want to be. Now, I'm going to need to see some identification from both of you." The woman fumbled in her purse with shaking hands, pulling out a wallet, and Officer Chen helped her extract her driver's license while the man grudgingly produced his own ID, his movements tight with barely suppressed rage. Sarah stood behind the counter, her heart pounding, watching as the situation unfolded with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety, because she knew that what happened in the next few minutes would determine whether her instinct had been right, whether her decision to call had saved this woman, or simply complicated an already difficult family situation. Officer Chen guided the elderly woman out of the booth, speaking to her in low, reassuring tones, and led her toward the front of the diner, away from the man who claimed to be her son, creating physical distance that allowed the woman's posture to gradually unfold, her shoulders dropping from their hunched position, her breathing becoming less shallow. Officer Martinez remained with the man, asking questions in a steady, professional manner. Where do you live? What's your relationship to this woman? Where were you planning to go after breakfast? And Sarah noticed how the man's answers came too quickly, too smoothly, rehearsed responses that didn't quite match the situation. Through the front window, Sarah saw another patrol car arrive, and a third officer entered, this one an older woman with silver hair and the kind of weathered competence that came from decades of service, and she made a beeline for Officer Chen and the elderly woman, introducing herself in tones too quiet for Sarah to hear. Officer Chen guided the elderly woman outside to one of the patrol cars, and through the window, Sarah watched as the woman began to speak, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, her hands gesturing, her face crumpling with emotion that had clearly been suppressed for far too long. Inside the diner, the man's veneer of calm civility was cracking further, his voice rising as he argued with Officer Martinez. "This is harassment," he insisted. "I'm a respected businessman. I've done nothing wrong. My mother is elderly and confused. She doesn't understand what she's saying." But Sarah noticed something interesting. He'd started referring to her as confused and elderly with increasing frequency, almost like he was trying to establish a narrative that would explain away whatever she might tell the police, trying to preemptively discredit her testimony by framing her as unreliable. Officer Martinez remained unimpressed, his questions becoming more pointed, more specific. "When was the last time your mother saw her personal physician? Does she have friends or family she communicates with regularly? Where are her personal belongings? Why isn't she wearing her wedding ring?" Each question seemed to land like a small explosion, disrupting the man's prepared responses, forcing him to scramble for explanations that became increasingly convoluted and contradictory. Sarah stood transfixed, barely aware of the other customers, who had abandoned all pretense of eating and were openly watching the drama unfold, their breakfast growing cold on plates, while history unfolded in the back corner booth. Linda appeared at her elbow, squeezing her arm gently. "You did the right thing," she murmured. "Whatever's going on here, you did the right thing." Outside, the third officer, the silver-haired woman, had joined Officer Chen, and both were now listening intently to the elderly woman, whose dam had clearly broken completely, whose words were spilling out in a torrent of relief and anguish. Sarah couldn't hear what she was saying, but she could read the body language, could see the officer's expressions shift from professional attention to something harder, something that looked like anger held carefully in check. After approximately 15 minutes, Officer Chen stood and walked back toward the diner, her expression grim, and she approached Officer Martinez with a few quiet words that Sarah couldn't hear but that made Martinez's jaw tighten. He turned to the man with new intensity. "Sir, based on what we've learned, we're going to need you to come with us to answer some additional questions." The man's face went through a rapid series of transformations: shock, rage, calculation, before settling on indignant outrage. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice loud enough to carry through the entire diner. "I haven't done anything illegal. You can't arrest me for taking care of my own mother." Officer Martinez's response was measured but firm. "Nobody said anything about arrest, sir, but we have concerns about potential elder abuse and financial exploitation, and we need to investigate further. You can come voluntarily, or we can discuss other options." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear, and after a long moment the man stood stiffly, grabbing his phone and wallet from the table with jerky, angry movements. As the officers escorted him out, he shot a look of pure venom towards Sarah, who stood frozen behind the counter, and she felt ice slide down her spine as she understood that he knew, that he'd figured out she was the one who'd called, that in his mind she had betrayed him, or interfered, or destroyed something he'd been carefully constructing. The door closed behind them with a cheerful chime that felt absurdly out of place, and suddenly the diner erupted in conversation, every customer talking at once, speculating about what they'd just witnessed, and Sarah felt her legs go weak, felt the adrenaline that had been sustaining her for the past half hour suddenly drain away, leaving her shaking and lightheaded. Marcus emerged from the kitchen, having watched the whole thing through the service window, and he looked at her with something like awe. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think you just saved that woman's life." Through the window, Sarah could see the elderly woman still sitting in the patrol car, but her posture had changed completely. She was sitting upright now, her hands animated as she continued speaking. Even from this distance, Sarah could see that the crushing weight of fear had lifted from her shoulders, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. An hour later, the breakfast rush had long since dissipated, and the diner sat in unusual quiet, most of the morning regulars having left to spread the story through the small town, and Sarah sat at the counter with a cup of coffee she couldn't quite make herself drink, her hands still trembling slightly with aftershock. The silver-haired officer, Sergeant Diaz, she'd introduced herself, had returned to take Sarah's formal statement, and she sat across from her with a notepad, asking detailed questions about everything Sarah had observed, every moment of interaction, every silent signal the woman had tried to send. "You have very good instincts," Sergeant Diaz said when Sarah finished recounting the morning's events. "A lot of people see signs like that and talk themselves out of acting, convince themselves it's none of their business or that they're reading too much into it." Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeking warmth she couldn't quite find. "What was happening to her?" she asked. "Was it really her son? What did she tell you?" Sergeant Diaz was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing what she could share, before responding carefully. "He is her son, but he'd been systematically isolating her since his father died 2 years ago, moved her out of her home into his house, cut off her contact with friends and other family members, took control of her finances and was draining her accounts to fund his failing business ventures. She tried to reach out for help a few times, but he monitored her phone, her email, her mail, everything. This morning was the first time in months she'd been in public without him controlling every second, and she took the chance to signal for help the only way she knew how." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as the full weight of what could have happened settled over her. "What would have happened if I hadn't called?" Sergeant Diaz's expression was grim. "Based on what she told us, he was planning to move her into a memory care facility within the next week, claiming she had dementia severe enough to require institutional care, which would have given him complete legal control and made it nearly impossible for anyone to question what he was doing with her assets. Once someone's institutionalized with a dementia diagnosis, it becomes very difficult for them to advocate for themselves or be believed if they try to report abuse. The casual evil of it, the calculated cruelty dressed up as caretaking, made Sarah feel physically ill. "Is she safe now?" "Where is she?" Sergeant Diaz nodded. "She's safe. Adult Protective Services has taken emergency custody. They're placing her temporarily with a specialized foster care provider while we investigate further, and we've frozen her accounts pending a full financial audit. Her son is looking at potential charges for elder abuse, financial exploitation and false imprisonment, among other things." Sarah exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "And she'll be okay, long term." The sergeant's smile was small but genuine. "She's 73 years old, physically healthy, mentally sharp despite what her son claimed, and she has 2 daughters who live out of state, who she hasn't been allowed to contact in over a year. We reached them this morning and they're flying in tomorrow. She has assets, she has family who care about her, and now she has freedom. Yes, I think she'll be okay." Linda appeared with fresh coffee, refilling both their cups, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested she'd been crying in the kitchen. "That poor woman," she said softly, "living like that for 2 years, and we see stories about this kind of thing on the news, but you never think it'll walk right through your door." Sergeant Diaz stood, tucking her notepad away, and handing Sarah a business card. "You might be called to testify if this goes to trial, but regardless of what happens legally, you should know that what you did today mattered. You saw something wrong, you trusted your instincts, and you acted. A lot of people don't. A lot of people look away because it's easier, because it's not their problem, because they don't want to get involved. You didn't look away, and that's going to change the entire trajectory of that woman's life." After the sergeant left, Sarah sat alone at the counter staring at her coffee, trying to process the morning's events and failing to quite grasp the enormity of it all. 7 days later, Sarah was refilling salt shakers during the mid-afternoon lull when she heard the bell above the door chime and looked up to see an elderly woman with perfectly styled silver hair enter the diner, and it took her a moment to recognize the same woman from the previous Thursday because everything about her was different. She stood straight now, her shoulders back, her eyes clear and bright, wearing a beautiful navy dress and pearls, looking like someone who'd spent her life with dignity and purpose rather than someone cowering in fear at a back booth. Sarah's hands froze on the salt shaker she was holding as recognition crashed over her, and the woman smiled, a real smile that transformed her face completely, and walked directly toward the counter. "Sarah," she said, her voice steady and warm, "I was hoping you'd be working today." Sarah came around the counter without thinking, and the woman pulled her into a hug that felt both fierce and fragile, and Sarah could feel her trembling slightly. "I wanted to thank you," the woman said, pulling back and looking directly into Sarah's eyes. "The officers told me you were the one who called, that you saw what I was trying to communicate when I couldn't say anything out loud." Sarah felt tears burning in her throat. "I'm just glad you're okay. I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing, if maybe I was misreading the situation." The woman gripped both of Sarah's hands in hers. "You didn't misread anything, you saw exactly what was happening, and you trusted yourself enough to act on it. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How many people see things that make them uncomfortable and convince themselves they're wrong because it's easier than getting involved?" She released Sarah's hands and pulled a small box from her purse. "My name is Margaret Lawson, and I wanted you to have this." Sarah opened the box to find a delicate gold bracelet with a small charm in the shape of a guardian angel, and she looked up at Margaret with confusion and protest already forming on her lips. "I can't accept this, Miss Lawson. I was just doing what anyone would." But Margaret shook her head firmly. "Most people wouldn't. That's the point, and I need you to understand something. My son had convinced me I was losing my mind, that my memories were unreliable, that I needed him to manage every aspect of my life, because I couldn't be trusted to make decisions for myself. He'd been drugging my morning coffee with sedatives to keep me compliant and confused, forging my signature on financial documents, telling my daughters I didn't want to speak to them anymore. That morning at the diner was the first time in months I'd been clear-headed enough to realize how desperate my situation had become, and I knew it might be my only chance to signal for help before he institutionalized me, and I disappeared completely." Sarah felt her legs go weak and gripped the counter for support as the full horror of what Margaret was describing settled over her like a weight. "The police found evidence of everything," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "The drug, the forged documents, the systematic theft of over $400,000 from my accounts, emails to memory care facilities inquiring about patients who couldn't have visitors without permission. If you hadn't called that morning, if those police officers hadn't intervened when they did, I would have been committed within a week, and once that happened, I would have had no way to prove I was competent, no way to reach my daughters, no way to stop what was happening." Sarah's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks unchecked, and Margaret reached up to wipe them away with surprising gentleness. "Don't cry for me, dear. I'm free now. I'm back with my daughters. I have lawyers handling the criminal case and the financial recovery, and I'm rebuilding my life. You gave me that chance. You, a young woman working the morning shift at a diner, who could have convinced herself she was wrong, who could have decided it wasn't her problem, who could have looked away like so many others do. But you didn't. You trusted your instincts and you acted with courage, and that changed everything." Margaret stayed for another 20 minutes, telling Sarah about her daughters, about the apartment she was moving into near the younger one, about the charges her son was facing and the restitution she would likely recover, about the therapy she'd started to process the trauma of those 2 years, and with each detail Sarah felt something inside her shift, and Seth felt the doubt and anxiety that had been plaguing her since that Thursday morning finally release its grip. When Margaret finally stood to leave, she hugged Sarah one more time. "You have a gift," she said quietly. "You see people really see them, and you care enough to act on what you see. Don't ever lose that. Don't let the world make you cynical or teach you to look away. What you did mattered more than you can possibly know." After she left, Sarah stood at the window and watched the black town car pull away, watched Margaret wave one last time before disappearing around the corner, and she thought about the strange, fragile nature of human connection, about how a single moment of attention, a single decision to trust your instincts and act, could alter the entire course of someone's life. She thought about all the small choices people made every day to speak up or stay silent, to get involved or mind their own business, to see suffering and respond or to look away because it was easier, safer, less complicated. Linda came up beside her, following her gaze out the window. That was her, wasn't it? The woman from last week. Sarah nodded, still holding the small box with the bracelet. She came to say thank you. Linda was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what I think you've been feeling stuck here, like this job is just something you fell into while you wait for your real life to start. But maybe this is exactly where you were supposed to be last Thursday morning. Maybe your real life has been happening all along and you just didn't recognize it." Sarah turned to look at her, and Linda smiled. "You saved someone's life today. Well, last week technically, but you understand what I mean. You did that, not some doctor or lawyer or police officer, just you being present and paying attention and giving a damn about a stranger. That's not nothing, Sarah, that's everything." The bell above the door chimed as new customers entered, and Sarah wiped her eyes, tucked the small box carefully into her apron pocket where she could feel its weight against her hip, and moved forward to greet them with a smile that felt different somehow, more substantial, more real. She understood now that heroism didn't always look like the movies suggested, didn't always involve dramatic rescues or grand gestures or special powers. Sometimes it was just a waitress noticing fear in an elderly woman's eyes, and deciding that the discomfort of getting involved was worth the possibility of help. Sometimes it was just trusting yourself enough to act when every instinct told you something was wrong. Sometimes it was just refusing to look away, when looking away would have been so much easier. The afternoon shift passed in its familiar rhythm, but Sarah moved through it with new awareness, watching faces, reading body language, paying attention to the small signals people sent when they thought nobody was looking, and she understood that this was her purpose, this was her contribution: to see people, to witness their struggles, to trust her instincts when something felt wrong, and to have the courage to act even when action felt risky or uncomfortable, or like it might be a mistake. Margaret Lawson's guardian angel bracelet rested in her pocket like a promise, like a reminder, like a small weight of responsibility that Sarah found she was ready to carry. And as the sun began to set outside the diner windows, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Sarah realized that sometimes the most extraordinary moments of your life happened in the most ordinary places, while you were doing the most ordinary thing. And that magic wasn't about escaping the mundane, it was about showing up fully present inside it, ready to see what needed to be seen, ready to act when action was required, ready to matter in the small, crucial ways that changed individual lives even if they never made headlines or history books.